The Pioneer Graveyard Historical Marker is located on the north side of the city park in Shepherdsville. It was placed there following the restoration of the cemetery in 2005. The earlier marker had seen significant weather damage and has been replaced with a new one, shown here. The marker lists the names of many of the folks buried there. They are identified by the rows also shown on the marker. Now, let's examine the history of this cemetery. In December 1793, the legislature of Kentucky approved an act to establish a town on 50 acres located on the north side of Salt River and owned by Adam Shepherd. Nazy Brashears, Samuel Crow, Michael Troutman, Frederick Pennybaker, Benjamin Stansbury, Joseph Brooks, and John Essery were named as the new town's trustees, and they gave Stansbury the task of laying out the town. By 1800, almost 100 people lived in the town, and they soon needed a place to bury their dead. It's not yet clear how the site was chosen, or who was first laid to rest there, but we know it existed as early as 1813, when it was mentioned in a deed from Adam Shepherd to John W. Beckwith and Frederick W. S. Grayson for 150 acres that lay along the river just west of town. That land, colored green on this map, and the location of the graveyard are both shown here. It was mentioned again in an 1828 legislative act confirming that the town trustees had purchased a slip of land 80 feet wide. It adjoined the town on the west and included a piece of ground for a graveyard. After the cemetery was restored, many gravestones were recovered, including nearly 40 field stones marking the graves of persons whose names are lost to us. Among those that we do know, a number perished in 1854 when a flood of the Salt River caused a cholera epidemic in Shepherdsville, resulting in many deaths, including Sarah Hogland, T.H. Applegate, Frederick Travis, Jacob Troutman, William B. Holesclaw, and others, all buried here. Two sets of doctors, each father and son, are also buried here. The first set were Dr. Samuel Adams McKay and his son, Dr. Charles William McKay. Judy Richardson of the Bullitt County History Museum wrote an article about Gardner McKay, a descendant of Samuel, and she now shares information she learned about Samuel and his son Charles.
Samuel McKay was born at the old McKay homestead about 2 miles from Bloomfield, Kentucky in 1809. In 1838, he married Dorcas Ann Neal, the daughter of a pioneer Spencer County family. After his marriage and after practicing medicine in and around Bloomfield, he and Dorcas moved to Shepherdsville. Samuel worked diligently to build up his practice and accumulated a comfortable estate. His home was about a mile east of Shepherdsville on the old Mount Washington Road. Samuel was tall, erect, over 6 feet in height, red hair, raw-boned and muscular. He was a founder of the First Baptist Church in Shepherdsville and was also a clerk and a trustee of the church. Dorcas died during the infancy of their child, Charles, and Sam later married Romelia A. Spurrier of Louisville. His son Charles was born in 1841. He attended Georgetown College and the medical department of the University of Louisville until the outbreak of the Civil War. During the war, he was a captain in the 10th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry, a regiment raised by future Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan. Among its numerous engagements, this unit participated in the Battle of Perryville. In 1865, he married Ella Maria Harris. They had 3 children who lived to maturity: Wallace, Donald, and Daisy. 2 other children died very young. Ella died in 1877, leaving behind a grieving husband and 3 very young children. Due to an illness, Charles died at the early age of 40 on October the 3rd, 1881, in Shepherdsville, Kentucky. He is buried in the Shepherdsville Pioneer Cemetery next to his 2 small children who did not survive. His father Samuel died in 1883 and is also buried in the Pioneer Graveyard next to his son Charles. Samuel and Dorcas also had 2 small children who did not live to maturity, and they too are buried next to their father.
The second pair of doctors were Henry Clay Christ and his son Ben Lewis Christ. David Strange wrote an article about them, and here he is to tell you more.
In 1872, Bullitt County could boast of having 2 doctors with the same legendary last name. These were Dr. Henry Clay Christ and his 23-year-old son, Dr. Ben Lewis Christ. These 2 men shared a medical practice as well as a famous family history, and before the year was out, they would share death. Henry Clay Christ was born in 1824, the son of the famous Bullitt County pioneer, General, and Congressman Henry Christ, the survivor of the Battle of the Kettles. Henry Clay Christ became distinguished in his own right as a Shepherdsville doctor, listed in the state Who's Who. He married Ann Morgan, and they had a son, Ben Lewis Christ. Born in 1849, Ben attended the University of Louisville, graduating from the medical department in March 1870. I imagine that father and son might have thought they had a bright future together in the medical profession, but it was not to be. On November 15, 1872, the young Ben Christ had an altercation that would change everything. The Courier-Journal reported the story thus, quote, Friday last was a black Friday for Shepherdsville. Dr. Ben Lewis Christ was a young man highly esteemed by everyone that knew him, and Mr. John H. West, his antagonist, is of the firm of Thompson and West, druggists, also a very popular young man. It seems that Mr. West had said something to a young lady in the village that did not exactly suit Dr. Christ. On Friday last, about 10 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Christ called at the drugstore of young West. According to the report, Christ remarked, John, you must apologize for what you told Miss F., or fight. The story goes on. Quote, West said he thought that an apology was not necessary, and then commenced to walk around the counter. When he had arrived at the end of the counter, Christ caught him by the collar and attempted to draw his pistol, when West caught his arm and prevented him from shooting. West, in the meantime, drew his own revolver, a self-cocking pistol, but the first shot entered his own leg above the knee and ranged downward. The 2 next shots took effect in Christ's abdomen and back. Ben Lewis Christ passed away the next day. The funeral was held in Shepherdsville and largely attended. John H. West was taken to jail, charged with willful murder. The news report concluded, quote, Dr. Christ's family are in the deepest distress and receive the sympathies of the entire community. Dr. Ben L. Christ was among the most popular young gentlemen in the county and Mr. West, although comparatively a stranger, is considered to be a clever gentleman. A.H. Field and R.J. Myler are retained for the defense, and General Jackson and Dick McConaughey are the prosecution. The murder case was set for December, then delayed to April 1873, with West released on $5,000 bond at that time. After a 4-day trial, West was acquitted of charges on April 3, 1874. I have no certain records of him after that. And so a life and a bright future were all too quickly ended in one moment of heated argument. Stated in some reports as a recounter or duel, the fight reads more like just a burst of emotion between two armed young men. But there is much more to this story. Almost exactly 1 month after Ben Crist died, his father, Henry Clay Crist, also died. Some stories say that he also approached Mr. West and met the same fate as his son. Other stories say that he died of a broken heart, quite young himself, at age 48. Nevertheless, father and son now lied side by side in the old Shepherdsville Pioneer Graveyard, next to the Shepherdsville Riverside Park, as they have since 1872. An interesting thing to me about this tragic story is that more than the Crists lie in that graveyard, almost everyone involved may well lie there as well, proving the old adage that all are eventually equal in the grave. George William Jackson, one of the prosecuting attorneys in the case, is there, and Judge Lorenzo Hoagland, the possible writer of the original report, and a former county judge, is buried there too. And who was the Miss F. whose honor the shooting was about? It is only an educated guess, as researcher Betty Darnell says, but she believes it might have been Julia Field, age 19 at the time, daughter of Richard Field and niece of A.H. Field. Julia married Edward Briscoe in February 1873, 3 months after the shooting. She died in childbirth October 24, 1873, and is buried in the old Shepherdsville graveyard as well.
Recognizing Julia Field Briscoe leads us to her parents, Richard and Kate, who are also buried here. Richard H. Field was Bullitt County's attorney in 1847 when he was elected to represent the county in the General Assembly in Frankfort, a post he held again in 1850. In 1851, he married Kate Swearingen, and they had 5 children. They made their home just north of Shepherdsville, near Gap and Knob. Richard was elected to the Kentucky Senate in 1861 and served there 4 years during the Civil War. Up until his death in 1881, Richard H. Field was well respected in his community. His wife Kate was a daughter of William Wallace and Julia Crist Swearingen, making her a granddaughter of Henry Crist and the niece of Dr. Henry Clay Crist. There are far too many others buried here to name them all, but we will mention a few. There were Robert F. Samuels and Charles R. Samuels, father and son. Robert was a circuit court clerk for Bullitt County. His son Charles was county court clerk. And here are the markers for County Judge Lorenzo Hoagland on the left, Sheriff Thomas J. Joyce in the middle, and Sheriff William Wallace Swearingen on the right. A visit to the cemetery and a copy of Betty Darnell's annotated reading of this graveyard will reveal much more than we can share here. For nearly a century, this was the final resting place of many Shepherdsville residents until, in 1894, a new cemetery named Hebron Cemetery was opened on the road to Louisville. It provided a place that didn't flood every few years, and many folks started using it. The flood of 1909 was the final straw for the Shepherdsville graveyard. The waters of Salt River once again covered much of the town and completely submerged the graveyard. Few burials had occurred there in the previous decade, and after the flood waters receded, it was decided to close the graveyard for good. Years passed, and nature was allowed to once again reclaim the land. Periodically, individuals and small groups would remember the graveyard and make attempts to restore it, but finally it became so overgrown and forgotten that few even knew it existed. In 1991, Boy Scouts from Troop 190 and Cub Scouts of Pack 687, along with local history enthusiasts, spent many weekends attempting to clean up and restore the graveyard. However, with no one working regularly to keep it cleared, the weeds, vines, and bushes returned. 6 years later, following another flood in 1997, the graveyard was rediscovered once again, and once again, some effort was made to restore it without lasting effect. Then, the local Scottish Rite Club of Freemasonry, joined by Mayor Joe Soame, the Shepherdsville City Council, and the Bullitt County History Museum, began a renewed effort in 2005. Brush and trees were cleared, monuments were located, repaired, and reset. The city of Shepherdsville took over perpetual care in 2005, providing renewed respect for the hallowed ground. After years of neglect, the Pioneer Graveyard is once again receiving the care and respect it deserves. This has been a presentation of the Bullitt County History Museum. Thank you for joining us.